I just can't believe this is happening.
The mahogany gavel had barely touched the bench when Judge Rebecca Thompson noticed the witness swaying at the stand. Without thinking, she rose from her seat, her black robes billowing as she moved. "Mom, are you all right?" The words escaped before she could stop them, and in that instant, Richard Thornfield's $3 billion world shattered. The billionaire CEO sat frozen at the defendant's table, his Armani suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket as every eye in the Manhattan courtroom turned between the judge, the witness, and him. The woman at the witness stand, Patricia Thompson, was his ex-wife. The judge who had just called her mom was Rebecca, the baby daughter he'd abandoned 30 years ago. Richard's hands gripped the edge of the oak table until his knuckles went white. This couldn't be happening. He'd buried Rick Thompson so deep that even private investigators couldn't find him. He'd paid good money to erase every trace of that life in Cleveland, every connection to the struggling salesman who'd walked away from a crying infant and an exhausted wife. But here they were, Patricia, with her silver hair and that same quiet dignity, and Rebecca, my God, Rebecca, wearing judge's robes and holding his fate in her hands. The math was simple and devastating. The 6-month-old baby he'd left behind was now a federal judge. The woman he'd abandoned to poverty while he built his empire had just testified about his company's exploitation of workers. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. He'd thrown them away like trash, and now they stood above him, one seeking justice, the other delivering it. His empire meant nothing in this moment. Thornfield Industries, with its 50,000 employees and its gleaming towers in 12 cities, was about to face massive fines and federal oversight. The Department of Labor had built an airtight case about wage theft and unsafe working conditions, but that wasn't what made Richard's chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. It was the recognition in Rebecca's eyes when she looked at him. She knew exactly who he was. She'd probably known from the moment he walked into her courtroom. And Patricia, who hadn't even glanced his way, had traveled from Ohio to testify against him. The billions he'd accumulated, the philanthropic foundation with his name in gold letters, the Manhattan penthouse and the house in the Hamptons, none of it could protect him from this moment of reckoning. But wait, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Are you ready for a story about choices that haunt you for 30 years? Because this one's just getting started. Have you ever made a choice that changed everything? Not just for you, but for everyone around you. Maybe you walked away from something or someone thinking it was for the best. Drop a comment below if you've ever wondered what happened to the people you left behind. Because Richard Thornfield was about to learn that some choices dawn and stay buried no matter how much money you throw on top of them. He thought abandoning his family was the price of success. Turns out it was just the down payment. The real cost? That was about to come due in a federal courtroom, with compound interest measured in decades of absence. Richard Thornfield wasn't just rich, he was untouchable rich. The kind of wealth where presidents took his calls and senators attended his charity galas. His name opened doors that stayed locked for everyone else. Thornfield Industries had started as a single acquisition in 1994, a failing textile company he'd bought for pennies on the dollar. Now, 50,000 employees across 4 continents. Manufacturing, logistics, healthcare facilities, his corporate tentacles reached into every corner of American commerce. Forbes had him at number 47 on their billionaires list. His second wife came from old Boston money, the kind that traced their lineage back to the Mayflower. Their twin sons attended Phillips Exeter, groomed from birth to inherit an empire. Richard sat on the boards of 3 Fortune 500 companies, and his donations had built entire hospital wings. When he walked into a room, conversation stopped. When he spoke, people listened. Even now, facing federal charges, he'd arrived at court in a motorcade of black SUVs, his legal team costing more per hour than most Americans made in a month. But here's what nobody knew. Richard Thornfield was a ghost wearing a $10,000 suit. The man sitting in that courtroom had been born Rick Thompson in a working-class neighborhood in Akron. No silver spoon, no trust fund, just a high school diploma and a talent for selling things people didn't need. He'd met Patricia at a bus stop in 1992. She was studying for her nursing boards, textbooks balanced on her knees. They'd married 6 months later in a courthouse ceremony, no rings, just promises they'd do better together than apart. When Rebecca was born, Rick held her for exactly 3 hours before deciding she was an anchor he couldn't afford. The transformation from Rick to Richard had required more than a name change. It meant creating fictional dead parents, a made-up scholarship to a state school, internships that never existed. He'd practiced losing his Midwest accent in the mirror of a YMCA bathroom. Every trace of Rick Thompson had been methodically destroyed. Old addresses, employment records, even the marriage certificate had somehow vanished from county records. He'd paid a lot of people to forget he'd ever existed. So why was he so confident walking into that courtroom? Because Richard Thornfield had never lost a fight that money could win. November in Cleveland meant early darkness and bitter wind off Lake Erie. Patricia Thompson pushed through the apartment building's door at 11:45 that night, her white nursing shoes squeaking against worn linoleum. 12 hours at Cleveland General had left her shoulders aching and her feet swollen. But she climbed the 3 flights to apartment 3B with practiced quiet. Rebecca would be sleeping, and their neighbor Mrs. Chen usually dozed off watching the baby. Patricia's key turned in the lock, and immediately she knew something was wrong. The apartment felt hollow, like the air had been sucked out. The living room lamp was on, but Rick's recliner was gone. The TV, too. She moved through the rooms in growing disbelief. His clothes, gone. His baseball trophies from high school, gone. The toolbox his father had given him, gone. Even the coffee maker they'd received as a wedding gift had vanished. In Rebecca's room, the baby slept peacefully in her crib, unaware that her world had just shifted on its axis. Mrs. Chen had left a note. Rick said you knew he was leaving. Paid me for tonight. Baby ate at 6 and 9. Patricia's legs gave out. She sat on the floor beside the crib, still wearing her coat, staring at the empty spaces where a life used to be. The note was on the kitchen table, held down by her house keys. He'd even taken his set. Rick's handwriting was steady, like he'd practiced what to say. Patricia, I got an opportunity in New York, real money, real future. But they want someone without baggage. I know that sounds harsh, but we both know this isn't working. You're always tired, I'm always frustrated. Rebecca deserves better than parents who stay together out of obligation. I took our savings because I need startup capital. I'll send divorce papers. Don't try to find me. This is better for everyone. You're strong. You'll figure it out. Rick. That was it. 3 years of marriage reduced to a paragraph. Their daughter dismissed as baggage. Patricia read it twice, then crumpled it into a ball. Later, she smoothed it out again, folded it carefully, and put it in a shoebox. Not as a keepsake, but as evidence. Proof that people could choose selfishness and dress it up as mercy. The first night alone, Patricia didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen, calculating numbers that wouldn't add up. Rent was due in 5 days, $800. The savings account Rick had emptied had contained $940, their emergency fund built from months of Patricia skipping lunches. Her next paycheck would be $500 after taxes, but daycare cost $300 a month. Mrs. Chen couldn't watch Rebecca every day. She had her own grandchildren to care for. The refrigerator hummed in the darkness, nearly empty except for formula and leftover rice. At 3 a.m, Rebecca woke up crying. Patricia heated a bottle with shaking hands, then held her daughter in the wooden rocking chair they'd bought at a yard sale. It's just us now, she whispered into Rebecca's soft hair. Daddy's gone to chase something shiny, but we don't need him. We have each other. The baby's fingers wrapped around Patricia's thumb, tiny but strong. Outside, Cleveland slept under a blanket of frost, unaware that in apartment 3B, a 24-year-old woman was rebuilding her entire life in the space between midnight and dawn. She called in sick the next day, the only time in 6 years she'd missed work, and spent it on the phone, negotiating payment plans, finding a cheaper apartment, locating a daycare that offered sliding scale fees. She sold her wedding ring to a pawn shop for $60. It had cost Rick $200, he'd told her proudly. Now it would buy diapers and formula for 2 weeks. That night, when Rebecca smiled for the first time since Rick left, Patricia made a decision. They wouldn't just survive this abandonment. They would transform it into something powerful. Every sacrifice would be a brick in the foundation of Rebecca's future. Rick thought he was escaping to something better. Instead, he'd freed them to become everything he'd never believed they could be. Patricia Thompson became a master of impossible mathematics. 24 hours in a day, but she needed 36. 40 hours a week at Cleveland General, plus 20 more picking up shifts at a nursing home on weekends. Sleep happened in fragments, 3 hours here, 2 hours there, always with one ear listening for Rebecca's cry. She studied for her nursing supervisor certification at bus stops, in break rooms, standing in line at the grocery store with flashcards hidden in her pocket. Other nurses would find her in the supply closet during 15-minute breaks, textbook propped against boxes of gauze, highlighting passages with a dried-out yellow marker she'd found in the hospital lost and found. Her dinner was usually crackers and peanut butter eaten standing up while Rebecca played in her second-hand high chair. The apartment they'd moved to was smaller, 1 bedroom instead of 2, but the rent was $200 less. Patricia gave Rebecca the bedroom and slept on a pull-out couch that groaned every time she moved. At 2 in the morning, she'd rock Rebecca back to sleep while reviewing medical terminology. Tachycardia, she'd whisper like a lullaby. Elevated heart rate, like Mama's when she thinks about the electric bill. Rebecca would gurgle in response, her tiny hand gripping Patricia's scrubs. By age 2, Rebecca could recognize the anatomy textbook by its red cover, pointing at it saying, "Mama's book." Patricia's coworkers started leaving extra food in the break room. Casseroles that accidentally made too much, sandwiches they couldn't finish. Patricia's pride burned, but she took them home anyway. Pride didn't fill Rebecca's stomach. Rebecca Thompson learned to walk in hospital hallways. She took her first steps between 2 rows of plastic chairs in the Cleveland General waiting room while Patricia worked a double shift and the security guard watched her. By age 4, she could name every bone in the human hand because Patricia's study materials were her only toys besides 3 stuffed animals from Goodwill. She did homework at a corner table in the hospital cafeteria, using medical journals as a flat surface when the table was too sticky. "Why don't I have a daddy?" she asked one day, age 5, watching another girl get picked up by her father. Patricia knelt down, looked her straight in the eye. "Some people aren't ready to be parents. Your father made a choice to leave. But that's about him, not about you. You are perfect exactly as you are." Rebecca nodded solemnly, then asked if she could have extra crackers with her soup. She never asked about her father again until she was much older. Instead, she became Patricia's shadow and shield. At 7, she started making Patricia lunch. 2 pieces of bread with whatever they had, usually jelly, sometimes just margarine with salt. She'd pack it in a brown paper bag with a note, "For the best mom. Love, RB." She learned to entertain herself during Patricia's 16-hour shifts. Books became her companions. First picture books from the library, then chapter books, then whatever she could find. She read medical textbooks when nothing else was available, sounding out words like pneumonia and prescription before other kids could spell cat. What would you do if the person who broke you was building an empire while you could barely afford groceries? If you found out they were living in penthouses while you were fainting from exhaustion? Would you seek revenge? Or would you do what Patricia did? Use that pain as fuel to build something even better? Comment below with what you think, because Patricia's response to finding out about Rick's success will surprise you. And if you're finding value in this story, remember to hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these incredible events. Share this with someone who needs to hear that rock bottom can become the foundation for something amazing. February 2007 started like any other day. Patricia had worked 3 consecutive doubles at Cleveland General, covering for nurses out with the flu. She was reviewing patient charts when the room started spinning. The next thing she knew, she was looking up at ceiling tiles from a hospital bed, with Rebecca's terrified face hovering above her. 14-year-old Rebecca had been called out of algebra class, her emergency contact pulled from Patricia's work file. The diagnosis hit hard: severe anemia, dangerous weight loss, early-stage heart arrhythmia from chronic stress. The doctor, Patricia's colleague of 15 years, didn't mince words. "Keep this up, you'll be dead before she graduates high school." Patricia had been living on 3 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day for so long her body had started consuming itself. Rebecca sat in that hospital room watching her mother's heart monitor, each beep a reminder that even the strongest people had limits. The woman who'd never missed a shift, who'd studied through pneumonia, who'd walked 5 miles to work when their car broke down, she was mortal after all. "Mom, you've been killing yourself to keep us alive," Rebecca said that night, holding Patricia's hand with its IV line. "Let me help. I can work too." She was already tutoring kids in math, $5 an hour under the table. But that moment, seeing her mother so fragile, Rebecca made a bigger decision. She would become a lawyer, not the corporate kind who helped rich people get richer, but the kind who fought for people like her mother. Workers who were exploited, parents who were abandoned, families crushed by systems designed to protect wealth instead of humanity. She started researching law schools that night on the hospital's public computer, writing down admission requirements in the notebook where she kept her homework. Harvard, Yale, Stanford. Impossible dreams for a girl from Cleveland whose mother was dying from poverty. But Rebecca had inherited more than her mother's eyes. She'd inherited her refusal to accept impossible as an answer. If her father could reinvent himself from nothing, then she could too, except she'd do it without abandoning anyone. Rick Thompson died in a Manhattan YMCA bathroom in 1994. That's where he practiced, eliminating his Ohio accent repeating Park Avenue, until it stopped sounding like Park Avenue. He studied how wealthy men walked, shoulders back, chin lifted, like the world owed them passage. He memorized wine names from library books, learned the difference between Oxford and Derby shoes from magazine photos. The transformation cost him everything he had stolen. $900 went to a fake transcript from Princeton, another $500 for a counterfeit MBA from Wharton. He invented dead parents who died in a car accident, tragically leaving their only son to make his way alone. Richard Thornfield emerged with a backstory so detailed he almost believed it himself. His fictional father had been in steel, his mother from Connecticut old money. He could describe their imaginary funeral, the house in Shaker Heights he'd never lived in, the trust fund that had supposedly paid for his education but had unfortunately been depleted by medical bills. At networking events, he'd mentioned summers on Martha's Vineyard that never happened, sailing lessons he'd never taken. When asked about family, he'd look appropriately sad, lost them young. Prefer not to discuss it. People respected grief, especially when it came wrapped in expensive suits. By 1996, he'd convinced a venture capital firm to give him seed money for his first acquisition. The partners never suspected that their Harvard-educated protege had actually learned about leveraged buyouts from a library book titled Corporate Finance for Beginners. His first company purchase was a struggling textile firm whose elderly owner reminded him of nobody, certainly not the father-in-law he'd never met. Within 3 years, Richard Thornfield was mentioned in the Wall Street Journal. Rick Thompson had been completely erased. Rebecca Thompson's Harvard acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March 2015. Patricia was at work, so Rebecca opened it alone in their kitchen, hands shaking. Full scholarship, the golden ticket that seemed impossible for a girl who'd written her application essays on a computer at the public library. She'd scored perfect on her LSATs after studying with borrowed books held together with rubber bands. Her personal statement about growing up in hospital waiting rooms while her mother saved lives had made the admissions committee cry, according to her interviewer. At Harvard Law, Rebecca turned down every corporate recruitment event. While classmates chased 6-figure starting salaries at white shoe firms, she interned at Legal Aid, making barely enough to cover ramen and bus fare. Her study group couldn't understand it. "You could make $300,000 at Cravath," they'd say. "Your mom could retire." But Rebecca had seen what happened when people chose money over meaning. She'd researched her father once, found Richard Thornfield's Forbes profile, seen his smiling face at charity galas. He'd gotten his money, but Rebecca wanted something else, the power to protect people like her mother from people like him. She graduated magna cum laude, turned down offers from firms that would have paid off her loans in 2 years. Instead, she clerked for a federal judge who'd grown up poor in Detroit, then joined the Department of Labor's litigation unit. Her starting salary was less than what Richard Thornfield spent on wine at a single dinner party. But when she successfully prosecuted her first wage theft case, recovering $2 million for hotel workers, Patricia cried harder than when Rebecca had graduated. "You're saving people," she said. "You're being the help we never had." Judge Rebecca Thompson earned her federal appointment at 32, making her the youngest federal judge in the Northern District of Ohio's history. The Senate confirmation hearings had been brutal, senators questioning whether someone so young could handle complex corporate cases. She'd answered every challenge with precision, citing precedents from memory, demonstrating a command of labor law that stunned even her critics. Her courtroom ran differently than most. She required plain English explanations for all motions, believing justice shouldn't hide behind legal jargon. Lawyers learned quickly that she had no patience for theatrics or delays, especially when workers' rights were at stake. She kept a photo on her bench, not visible to the courtroom, of her mother in scrubs, a reminder of who the law was meant to protect. Her decisions were rarely overturned on appeal because she wrote opinions so thoroughly researched they left no room for ambiguity. Defense attorneys whispered about her in courthouse hallways. "She reads everything, every footnote, every exhibit. You can't slip anything past her." Prosecutors loved her because she held corporations to the same standards as individuals. In 3 years on the bench, she'd presided over 200 cases, many involving wage theft and worker exploitation. She had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions, for seeing through corporate veils to the human cost beneath. What nobody knew was that she kept a crumpled piece of paper in her desk drawer, her father's abandonment note, now yellowed with age, a reminder that choices have consequences that echo across decades. The Thornfield Industries case had been building for 2 years. DOL investigators had uncovered a systematic scheme affecting 40,000 employees across 17 states. Overtime violations, misclassified workers, stolen wages. The total approached $300 million. But it was worse than simple theft. Internal emails showed Richard Thornfield personally directed the scheme, calling workers expendable, units and overtime pay unnecessary overhead. He'd created shell companies to hire workers, then dissolved them when complaints arose. Maintenance staff were classified as independent contractors despite working full-time schedules. Janitors were forced to clock out and continue working, their unpaid hours called voluntary training. The evidence filled 23 boxes, each document a story of someone choosing between complaining and feeding their family. Whistleblowers described a culture of fear where questioning company practices meant immediate termination. Richard Thornfield's signature appeared on memos discussing workforce optimization through strategic compensation restructuring, corporate speak for wage theft. The case was assigned to Judge Thompson through routine rotation, a computer randomly selecting her from 8 possible judges. The clerk who delivered the file didn't notice her slight intake of breath when she saw the defendant's name. Richard Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Industries, charged with criminal wage theft, conspiracy, and racketeering. She opened the file that night in her chambers, alone except for the security guard doing rounds. There he was, her father, though he'd never claimed that title. Older now, distinguished gray at his temples, but the same eyes she saw in her mirror every morning. The same sharp jawline, the same careful smile. She could have recused herself immediately, cited personal conflict. Should have, according to judicial ethics. But she thought about her mother's collapsed veins from years of blood donations to pay rent, about every night Patricia went hungry so Rebecca could eat. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice finding its way home, Patricia Thompson adjusted the microphone with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been called as a witness to testify about the impact of wage theft on healthcare workers. Her expertise after 30 years in the field made her invaluable to the prosecution. She wore her best suit, the navy one Rebecca had bought her for Christmas, and kept her eyes on the prosecutor. But when Richard Thornfield leaned forward at the defense table, she felt his stare like a physical weight. The recognition hit him in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, then something close to panic. This wasn't possible. Patricia was supposed to be a ghost from another life, trapped in Cleveland poverty while he soared. Yet here she sat, professional and composed, describing how hospital workers often worked unpaid overtime because they couldn't abandon patients. Her voice never wavered as she explained the human cost of wage theft, missed rent payments, choosing between medication and food, children growing up in daycare because their parents needed multiple jobs. Richard's expensive attorney noticed his client's distraction, whispered a question. Richard waved him off, unable to look away from the woman he'd abandoned 31 years ago. She was different, older certainly, but with a dignity he didn't remember, or perhaps had never noticed. The moment shattered when Patricia swayed slightly on the stand. The court reporter asked if she needed water, but before Patricia could answer, Judge Thompson was already moving. "Mom, are you all right?" The words came out instinctively, 3 decades of protective habit overriding judicial protocol. The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor's pen stopped mid-note. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. Richard Thornfield's face went white, then gray, like someone had drained all his blood. Rebecca caught herself immediately, but it was too late. The word hung in the air like a confession. Patricia's eyes met her daughter's from the witness stand, a moment of shared recognition that their carefully separate worlds had just collided. The defense attorney stood slowly, processing the implications. "Your Honor, did you just address the witness as—" Rebecca straightened in her robes, her voice returning to its professional register. "The court calls a 15-minute recess." She struck her gavel with more force than necessary, the sound echoing off the walls like a gunshot. The recess stretched with uncomfortable tension. In the hallway, lawyers huddled in confused clusters, trying to piece together what they'd witnessed. The lead prosecutor pulled up Rebecca's background on his phone, then Patricia Thompson's witness file. The connections formed like a constellation, same last name, same Cleveland address from years ago. Inside the conference room, Rebecca's clerk was already researching recusal procedures, printing relevant statutes. This was grounds for immediate removal from the case, clear conflict of interest. But in the defense room, a different drama unfolded. Richard sat perfectly still while his $300,000 legal team scrambled. "This is perfect," his lead attorney said. "Immediate mistrial. Personal bias. We can get this whole thing thrown out." Richard stared at the table's wood grain, seeing Patricia's face when she'd recognized him, seeing a young woman in judge's robes who had his mother's nose, his father's stubborn chin. "No," he said quietly. His lawyers stopped. "Richard, this is a gift. The judge is the daughter you abandoned. No jury will trust her neutrality." Richard looked up, and for the first time in 30 years, Rick Thompson's voice came through. "I said no. We proceed. No mistrial motion." His attorney started to argue, but Richard's expression killed the words. He'd run from this moment for 3 decades, built an empire on the lie that his past didn't exist. But Patricia had raised their daughter to become a federal judge. Rebecca had climbed higher than he ever imagined, without his money, without his name meaning anything except the one he'd running from. When court reconvened, defense counsel stood. "Your Honor, my client has been made aware of the unusual circumstances. We've discussed filing for recusal." The courtroom held its breath. Richard stood slowly, addressed the court for the first time. "Your Honor, I waive any objection to your continued involvement in this case." Rebecca's expression remained neutral, but her hands gripped the edge of the bench. "Mr. Thornfield, you understand that you have grounds for requesting a different judge?" "I understand," Richard replied, his voice steady. "But I believe justice is best served by proceeding." Their eyes met across the courtroom, father and daughter, stranger and stranger, connected by blood and divided by choice. The prosecutor stood. "The government has no objection to Judge Thompson continuing." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then we proceed. Mrs. Thompson, please retake the stand." Patricia walked back to the witness chair, passing within feet of the man who'd written that she and their baby were baggage. The rest of her testimony was flawless, clinical, devastating. She never looked at Richard again, never acknowledged their shared history. She spoke only of wage theft's impact, letting the facts build their own verdict. The truth didn't need embellishment when it was this powerful. Patricia Thompson became the voice of 40,000 silent workers that day. "When you steal wages from a single mother working doubles at a hospital," she testified, her voice carrying across the courtroom, "you're not just taking money. You're taking her child's lunch for the week. You're taking the antibiotics she needs but can't afford. You're taking her dignity when she has to choose between keeping the lights on or buying winter shoes." She spoke without notes, each word carved from personal experience. "I've watched colleagues faint from exhaustion because they worked off the clock, afraid that refusing meant losing their jobs. I've seen maintenance workers, the people who keep hospitals safe and clean, classified as contractors so companies could avoid paying benefits while their children got sick without insurance." Her testimony built like a symphony, each example adding another layer of corporate cruelty. These aren't numbers on a spreadsheet, they're human beings with mortgages, medical bills, children who deserve better. When executives decide that overtime pay is unnecessary overhead, they were deciding that workers' time with their families has no value. She described nurses missing their own children's graduations because they needed the hours, janitors working through pneumonia because sick days weren't paid. The theft isn't just financial, it's theft of opportunity, of health, of hope. Workers age faster, die younger, also companies can report better quarterly earnings. Patricia never mentioned her own story directly, but it bled through every word. The nights she'd gone hungry, the years she'd worked sick, the childhood Rebecca had sacrificed. Rebecca gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles went white, using physical pressure to anchor herself in the present. Every instinct screamed to comfort her mother, to acknowledge the pain behind those carefully professional words. Instead, she took notes with mechanical precision, her handwriting perfectly level despite the tremor in her chest. When Patricia's voice cracked slightly describing a worker who'd lost custody of her children because she couldn't match her ex-husband's income, Rebecca forced herself to look at the court reporter, the flag anywhere but her mother's face. She'd presided over hundreds of testimonies, heard countless stories of corporate exploitation, but none had ever threatened her composure like this. Her mother was describing their life without naming it, speaking their truth while maintaining the fiction that they were strangers. Rebecca felt 14 again, watching her mother collapse in that hospital bed, except now she had power, the authority to deliver justice her mother had never received. The challenge was remaining neutral when every cell in her body vibrated with rage at the man sitting 20 feet away, the father who'd never been one. Richard Thornfield experienced the strange sensation of his carefully constructed identity crumbling from the inside. Patricia's words stripped away 3 decades of justification, revealing the ugly truth beneath his success. Every worker she described could have been her, was her, in different clothes. The maintenance staff he cheated had Patricia's exhausted eyes. The nurses forced to work unpaid overtime had her determined jaw. He'd told himself the abandonment was strategic, that leaving had been best for everyone. But watching his daughter, brilliant, accomplished, principled, preside over his judgment, he understood the lie he'd been living. Rebecca had become everything he'd pretended to be, genuinely educated, genuinely successful, genuinely respected. She'd earned what he'd stolen. Patricia had raised her alone while he'd been raising capital, building his empire on the same exploitation that had nearly killed them both. His attorneys kept sliding him notes about legal strategy, but Richard couldn't focus on anything except the two women who'd survived his cruelty and emerged stronger. His fortune felt suddenly worthless, his achievements hollow. Patricia finished her testimony by looking directly at him for the first time. Wage theft is abandonment by another name. It's walking away from your obligations because profit matters more than people. The words weren't about their past, legally speaking, but Richard heard the accusation, felt the weight of 31 years of compound interest on his original betrayal. Could you deliver justice to someone who destroyed you? Could you look into the eyes of the person who abandoned you and speak the law without letting emotion color a single word? Rebecca Thompson faced this impossible test as she prepared to read the verdict that would define both their futures. Before we hear what she decided, remember that if this story has moved you, sharing it helps others find hope in their own struggles. Like this video if you believe justice can heal old wounds. Subscribe because Rebecca's final words to her father will absolutely floor you. And comment below. Would you have recused yourself or done what Rebecca did? What happened next proves that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Will the defendant please rise? Rebecca's voice filled the courtroom with quiet authority. Richard Thornfield stood slowly, his three-piece suit no longer armor but costume. The jury foreman had already delivered their verdict to the bailiff, who'd handed it to Rebecca with the same routine motion used in 1,000 other cases. But nothing about this moment was routine. Mr. Thornfield, you have been found guilty on all counts. 43 counts of criminal wage theft, 18 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, 12 counts of racketeering. Each word was measured, professional, devoid of the fury she'd carried for 31 years. The jury has found that you personally directed a scheme that stole $287 million from workers over 15 years. You created shell companies to avoid accountability. You destroyed documents. You terminated whistleblowers. She paused, looking directly at him. You chose profit over people, systematically and repeatedly. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, the impact on victims. Your actions weren't mistakes or oversights. They were deliberate choices to extract value from those least able to fight back. Richard's hands trembled slightly as Rebecca continued. The wealth you accumulated came directly from parents who couldn't afford medicine, from workers who lost homes, from families destroyed by poverty you helped create. The subtext hung between them like a confession neither could speak aloud. Every word Rebecca chose carried double meaning, visible only to 3 people in that room. When she said abandoned responsibilities, Patricia heard the note left on their kitchen table. When she mentioned children growing up without resources they deserved, Richard saw the young girl he'd never met struggling through law school on loans and willpower. Your sentence will reflect not just the monetary theft, but the human cost, the opportunities stolen, the dreams deferred, the suffering you caused while building your empire. Rebecca's voice never cracked, but Richard heard the child he'd rejected in every syllable. She was judging him not just as a criminal, but as the father who'd written them off as baggage. Patricia sat in the gallery, tears running silently down her face. Not for Richard, but for her daughter, who was demonstrating more grace than he'd ever deserved. Rebecca spoke about accountability, about choices defining character, about wealth without conscience being the greatest poverty. Richard heard his obituary, being written by the daughter he'd thrown away. The financial press would report his conviction, but Rebecca was delivering a different verdict, one about a man who'd gained everything and lost himself, who'd traded his family for a fortune that was now being stripped away. The woman judging him had climbed higher than he ever could. Without stolen credentials or abandoned children, she'd built her success on truth while his crumbled under its weight. Richard Thornfield's conviction exploded across financial media within hours. Billionaire's wage theft empire exposed ran on every major network. But the real destruction came from an unexpected source, a courthouse reporter who'd connected the dots. Thornfield judged by abandoned daughter became the story that destroyed what the conviction hadn't touched. His wife, Eleanor, learned about Patricia and Rebecca from a CNN alert on her phone. She filed for divorce that afternoon, taking their 3 children, Richard's legitimate family, back to her father's estate in Connecticut. His country club revoked his membership. The charity boards he'd sat on released statements distancing themselves from his actions. Harvard Business School, where he'd claimed to guest lecture, revealed they had no record of him ever attending, let alone teaching. The investigators, emboldened by his conviction, found more lies. The Princeton degree was fake, the Wharton MBA purchased from a diploma mill. His entire identity unraveled like a cheap suit in the rain. Forbes removed him from their lists. His assets were frozen pending restitution payments. The Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the art collection he'd bought but never understood, all seized. Within 3 months, Richard Thornfield existed only in court documents and cautionary tales told at business schools about the cost of ethical bankruptcy. His fellow inmates at the Federal Correctional Facility knew him only as inmate number 47,382B, a man whose own daughter had sent him to prison. 6 months after the trial, a letter arrived at Rebecca's chambers, forwarded through the court clerk. Richard's handwriting, though she'd never seen it before, was immediately familiar. She wrote her R's the same way. "Dear Rebecca, I know I have no right to call you daughter. I threw that right away with a note and $500 31 years ago. I've written this letter 100 times, destroyed it 99. You deserve to know that watching you in that courtroom was like seeing who I could have been if I'd chosen courage over cowardice. Your mother raised you to be everything I pretended to be, brilliant, principled, genuinely successful. I stole my fortune. You earned yours. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Some abandonments can't be forgiven. I'm only writing to say that you gave me the only real justice I deserved, being judged by the person I should have helped raise. Your mother was right to protect you from me. You became remarkable without me, probably because of my absence. I won't contact you again. But know that for the first time in my life, I felt actual pride, not in anything I'd done, but in who you became despite what I didn't do. The man who was never your father, Richard." Rebecca read it once, then handed it to her clerk. "Return to sender," she said quietly. "No forwarding address." The letter came back stamped, undeliverable. Richard never knew if she'd read it. That uncertainty became part of his punishment. Sunday mornings belonged to them now. Patricia would arrive at Rebecca's apartment at 8, bringing groceries for their weekly tradition. They'd make pancakes from scratch, the way they'd always dreamed of when breakfast had been whatever was on sale. Patricia would tell stories from the hospital. Rebecca would share courthouse dramas, carefully avoiding any mention of the trial that had changed everything. They'd established an unspoken rule. Richard's name was forbidden in this space. He'd taken enough from them. He wouldn't take Sunday mornings, too. But sometimes, while flipping pancakes, Patricia would catch Rebecca's eye and see the question there. Was justice enough? And Patricia would answer without words, pulling her daughter into the kind of hug they'd perfected during all those years of having only each other. They'd survived him. They'd succeeded despite him. They'd found peace in the life they'd built from the ashes of his abandonment. The pancakes were never perfect, sometimes burnt, sometimes raw in the middle, but they tasted like victory, like a promise kept, like 2 women who'd refused to let one man's cruelty define their capacity for joy. The sun would stream through Rebecca's kitchen windows, and for those few hours, the past felt properly buried. Rebecca Thompson's story teaches us that success isn't inherited. It's earned through perseverance, principle, and the courage to face impossible circumstances. Her mother, Patricia, proved that single parents aren't broken families. They're complete families, who work twice as hard for half the credit. Their journey from that abandoned kitchen table to a federal courtroom shows us that our beginnings don't determine our endings. We determine them through the choices we make every single day. Richard Thornfield had every advantage: wealth, connections, freedom to pursue his ambitions, yet he ended up morally bankrupt long before he was financially ruined. Rebecca had nothing except a mother who worked double shifts and never complained, who sold her blood to buy school supplies, who taught her daughter that integrity matters more than income. The lesson isn't about revenge or even justice. It's about building something meaningful from the rubble of disappointment. Patricia never poisoned Rebecca against her father. She simply lived a life that proved his abandonment was his loss, not theirs. Rebecca never sought to destroy Richard. She simply became someone whose accomplishments made as pale in comparison. They teach us that the best response to being underestimated is excellence. That poverty isn't shameful, exploiting others is. That true wealth isn't measured in portfolios but in the people who stand by you when you have nothing to offer except yourself. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it right now. Maybe it's a single parent, wondering if they're enough for their children. They are. Maybe it's someone who's been abandoned, betrayed, left to build alone. They can. Maybe it's someone choosing between easy money and hard principles. Choose principles. Like this video if you believe that character matters more than credentials. Subscribe because every week we tell stories that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to let circumstances define them. Comment below with your own story of overcoming abandonment or betrayal. This community exists to remind each other that we're never truly alone in our struggles. The true meaning of wealth isn't what Richard thought. It's not about accumulation but contribution. Patricia was wealthy in every way that mattered, respected by colleagues, loved by her daughter, able to sleep peacefully knowing she'd never built her comfort on someone else's suffering. Rebecca's success wasn't measured in prestigious titles, but in the workers who got their stolen wages back, the families who could finally afford stability. Real success is Patricia and Rebecca making pancakes on Sunday mornings, laughing about nothing special, secure in the knowledge that they have each other. It's knowing that when you're gone, people will remember how you made them feel, not what you took from them. Richard will die surrounded by prison walls he earned. Patricia and Rebecca will live surrounded by the love they've cultivated. That's the ultimate verdict. We all eventually get exactly what we've given.